Okay, thank you for joining us for this media avail. Given the late hour, I will just let you know that we are going straight to the Mayor for remarks that are brief, and we'll have time for one question per media outlet. And we also have Adam Laughlin here for any additional questions you might have. So I turn it over to the Mayor.
Well, in advance, happy Canada Day. Mask up for it if you're out. So on the matter before us today, we've now had a chance to hear from 140 community members over the past several weeks, as well as today Edmonton Police Service and Edmonton Police Commission. We weren't able to get to a final conclusion today on a debate on the motions before us, so Council will continue to look at those amendments and the final motion on Thursday afternoon. But here's what I've heard so far. There are many public and many expert perspectives on how community safety and crime prevention needs to look. Those perspectives range from everything from more training and other reforms to divestment and diversion of funds to outright abolition of policing. But I do think that everyone wants a safe community and wants the right supports in place for people in distress. Now, if these hearings have highlighted anything, it's the need to continue to move away from the status quo. So I'm glad to hear that the Edmonton Police Commission say that they also hear the need for change and are willing to make systemic changes within policing alongside partners that will result in better community safety outcomes. And it's also great to hear the police chief clearly say today that racism has no place within the Edmonton Police Service and that he is committed to listening and is committed also to making improvements. Now, as mayor, I have struggled with trying to integrate all of these different perspectives, especially from across the hearing and the many different correspondences that we've received, and incorporate those so that we can ensure we make positive decisions that move things forward in a way that can address people's concerns, but also work in a collaborative manner with police and frontline workers to get better outcomes. So the public hearing and council discussions have been emotional. I can tell you that at times some of the comments have landed pretty close to home. But I understand that this work is not about me, though it has forced me to examine my biases and examine my preconceptions. But as elected leaders, our job is to ensure we keep an open mind on how best to build an inclusive city where everyone feels safe. Over the years, I have worked to ensure our city is safer and more inclusive, but there's more work to do. And today's amendments do move us closer, I believe, to this goal. I am proud that we are the only city in Alberta that has chosen to have public hearings and that has allowed so many diverse views to be heard. And I know many may not give credit for that, but it does matter, and it is historic. We've also tried to be transparent and accessible throughout this process and appreciate the community's willingness to work with us through this very complicated process. The range of speakers we've had makes me so proud as your mayor. People from all walks of life have very vulnerably shared their stories and their experiences of what happened to them in our city, including many instances of trauma and systemic racism, and everyone deserves to be respected for their perspectives. So our role as council now is to find the common ground in all of these views where we can and make changes that will contribute to better outcomes. Today we got as far as agreeing that changes are needed. We haven't come to the final conclusion on what resources should go to whom, because we want to be very thoughtful about that and ensure we get our investments right. But from what I heard in today's debate, there does seem to be an agreement that we cannot police ourselves out of social injustices and inequity in our community. We need to continue to invest in other community safety initiatives beyond and in parallel to the Edmonton Police Service. I feel like I can safely say that all of us on council are committed to serving our community well and ensuring people who need access to mental health and social supports get the resources they need so they don't end up unnecessarily interacting with our justice system. And while no final budgetary decisions were made today, we did signal, ultimately, an intent to redirect $11 million starting next year from policing and into housing and other prevention and community safety initiatives. The final word on the details of this redirection of funding will come in the fall when Council discusses the fall budget amendments. This time will allow the Edmonton Police Commission, the Edmonton Police Service, to prepare for these changes, and also allows administration and potentially a community safety and well-being task force, so that hasn't been finalized, to work together to develop a clear plan on how we can use this 11 million, in addition to our other investments, to best support community. Now, I'm also pleased to see that my amendment to add some specificity around how that 11 million might be spent was carried, and includes specific reference to more permanent supportive housing aligned with our goal to end homelessness, to alleviate the strain on our healthcare, social service, and corrections, and justice, and policing systems. I think there's a way to leverage some of these dollars to pay the mortgages on the remaining 650 units we have to build to deliver the 900 to end homelessness. That will take time, but it will also produce a reduced demand for service for policing, and for that matter, for the Government of Alberta's many services that individuals experiencing homeless interact with. So I'm optimistic we can make some structural and systemic positive change in our community using this $11 million. Now, in addition to these budget considerations, this motion also makes a number of recommendations and changes that we hope will enhance accountability in the way police will interact with racialized and or vulnerable people. This includes reporting back on the recommendations in the city's Street Checks Police and Practice Review report by October of 2020, and instructing the Police Commission to work with city administration to determine how calls driven by mental health, addictions, and homelessness or other social and public health factors can be better responded to by partners through interagency partnerships without police intervention and through integrated approaches to dispatch. So, all in all, the motion also considers that we can try to figure out how to make best use of times and resources. For example, we introduced an amendment today that would look at some of our bylaws and the way we enforce those bylaws to see if there are better ways that we can do that. For example, do we want to be spending so much time giving people jaywalking tickets, which can begin a pathway down criminalization of just being out on the street, or should that time be spent differently, and should those rules operate differently? So how we keep people safe that doesn't lead to penalizing poverty or criminalizing behavior for simple bylaw infractions. So lots of substantive amendments came forward today that were considered, but the bottom line is that systemic racism does exist in our society and in our city and in our public services and institutions, including policing. And we hope that this motion will help address this issue and move Edmonton towards a more equitable and just future. And I look forward to continuing and concluding this, for now at least, this conversation with City Council on Thursday afternoon. Now, shifting gears to one of my favorite holidays of the year, very briefly, this Canada Day celebrations are going to look and feel different, and a lot of people will be tempted to have parties and potlucks, but I hope that you and your loved ones find safe ways to celebrate this year, and please remember to follow public health guidelines, especially around separate food and beverages, and remember, it only takes one gathering to start an outbreak. We've seen that here in our city. The numbers now relate to gatherings where people got together, shared food, didn't maintain social distancing, didn't maintain hygiene. So please, tomorrow and every day until this pandemic is behind us, keep your distance outside your cohort, wear a mask if you cannot keep your distance, and wash your hands, and stay safe, Edmonton. Thank you. Happy to take your questions on this or anything else.
Thank you, and also thank you to our interpreters today, Kevin Cope and Diane De Andrade. And on the phone we have Brienne from Global, so you may go first, Brienne. Might still be muted. Okay, we'll try Vinesh. Vinesh, would you like to go next?
Yes, Mayor, you mentioned how this could impact health, the justice system. So again, are you worried the city is being asked to take on too much here, and that the province, which is their responsibility for these social supports, is kind of letting the city take on these responsibilities? And then are you worried about the precedent that this might set on a go-forward basis?
Great question, Vinesh. Thank you. I think the city has asked politely for years, and for a period of time we had a robust partnership with the government of Alberta around our work to end homelessness, and there's some ongoing discussions around different approaches to supporting people with addictions and mental health challenges. This government has recently put more money into spaces, which would be an important part of stabilizing people in their addictions recovery journey, to help them be able to be successful in supportive housing, for example. So many of the levers, as I've said many times, are in the hands of the provincial government, but some of the levers are in the hands of the City of Edmonton. I think some of what the motion calls for is an analysis of just what the province is spending on the social safety net for the outcomes that they're getting, and I think there's far more money there than there is in policing, much less what the city does. So a redirection of $11 million out of a $400 million police budget into housing initiatives and other initiatives won't take over provincial jurisdiction around housing by a long shot. It would just help us move ahead with the supportive housing portion at the most acute end of the unfilled need in the housing space. And would also allow us to do some community development work and perhaps fund some other, scale up some of the successful initiatives like the 24/7 crisis diversion team. Again, the benefits of all of these investments primarily accrue to provincial and federal governments in the form of lower demand for their very expensive services, including healthcare in particular, and also higher participation in the economy. So they'll actually get an economic uplift and a productivity uplift, which they'll capture through their tax tools and lower costs. The City of Edmonton doesn't get that through property taxes, but it's the right thing to do, and waiting for others to act, frankly, we've had enough of that, and we've heard a clear call from our community that it's time for us to make some indicative moves here. But at the end of the day, the motion will also still ask to study all of those systemic questions, give advice to the province about how to get better outcomes for the dollars that they're already putting in. And so I think we'll wind up in a thoughtful place there once all that analysis is done, without taking on the burden of provincial jurisdiction across particularly the health, mental health and addictions side of this. But housing is an area where our council has chosen even this week, yesterday with our moves to go ahead with 4 more sites for permanent supportive housing, strongly supported by council. So that's an area where we've decided to act, but systems change will require provincial and federal governments to weigh in as well.
Thank you. And like I said, sorry that we're tight for time for just one question each today, but you'll also get a chance for another media avail on Thursday as we follow up on this debate. So next we're going to Dustin Cook with the Edmonton Journal. Go ahead, Dustin.
For taking my question. Mr. Mayor, I'm wondering if you can comment on the decision for the 11 million reduction, or to prepare that budget amendment and not the 16, and explain this. I know you actually voted for the 16, but explain this to residents who have been calling on council for the last 2 weeks to do the 16 million, but also go further than that. And if this 11 million will be enough to support any community-led policing that is also being called for here. If that's going to be diverted to that, is that enough to go to these social supports?
Is that I don't think this 11 million or the 16 for that matter is the be-all and end-all of this question. I still think that over time the motion drives potential for a lot of other changes. For example, more deployment of mental health workers and social workers alongside police through integrated dispatch, as well as the potential, and we haven't voted on these parts yet, but of more roles for community safety officers, according to the Yukon model, for example, that's come up quite a bit, so that we send fewer sort of fully equipped traditional police officers with badges and guns out, and more opportunities to right-size that response with community safety officers and social work and mental health workers. And so I think there could be further changes and adjustments beyond this 11 million. Who's going to deliver that and what the governance is going to be for that is one of the things that the motion calls for further analysis on, because we're not in a position to make those bold moves in one step today. So there's more information gathering and more engagement with the community and with experts called forth in the motion, potentially through a community safety and well-being task force with a short-term mandate to look at all of these complex questions. So there could be further significant changes that might be more in line with some of the divestment suggestions that came forward to us, but also managed in a way that respects that we need to maintain community safety today. And if you want to invest in prevention, that needs to take time. And if you want to change your response, you need to hire people, train people, equip people, have an accountability framework for them, and transition to that over time. So that we're going to honor the complexity of the change people are asking for through doing some more work, potentially through this task force. I think the 11 million will be substantial. I think I'm disappointed that it was reduced based on what was shown to the public previously, but that's I respect that Council's decision was based on some information that came forward from police, who reminded us that the government of Alberta shaved some user fees and transaction fees to a greater degree on ticketing, which police had already absorbed this year. So there was some sympathy for that. I think that was one of the new pieces of information that may have persuaded some members of council to go for 11 instead of 16, for example. So I still think 11 will have a material impact on housing and community development, and I think the conversation doesn't end there.
Thank you. Next, we're going to Natasha from CBC. Go ahead, Natasha.
Thank you. Actually, a good follow-up to Dustin's question. If Mayor Iveson, you could just touch a little bit on what you said regarding going from policing to prevention, and also, how much progress do you think this Edmonton Police Service in the past year has made? Chief McKee kind of highlighted that they had already been putting things in motion, and that cutting their budget even more would slow them down. If you could comment on the progress that you've seen with them in the past year or so.
I think the tone has certainly changed with the service to really embrace the notion that prevention work and integrated response with other agencies and other frontline supports needs to improve. That's very much the chief's mandate as from when he was hired by the commission and when that hire was ratified by council. So I hear the concern that a reduction in resources could slow the work, and I would agree with that if the resources were coming out of the system. If it was just a straight cut to lower taxes, then the money would be coming out of the community safety ecosystem. But I think the premise here is that the money will stay in the system. It'll just come out of policing on the premise that they can absorb some reductions, partly because costs are coming down, notwithstanding PPE. We're all entering a period of economic contraction and likely lower cost escalation, and they need to do more with less. But unlike most other services, in this case, the dollars would actually be redirected based in large part on what the community has suggested in recent weeks to a variety of community development prevention programs that should actually reduce demand for police response over time. So I think it's consistent with the overall vision, so long as the money doesn't come out of the system. It just gets redirected to those other non-police prevention strategies.
Okay, thank you. And next we have Keith from the Journal. Please go ahead, Keith.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. I want to ask about a related aspect of this, but I'm not sure if it's covered specifically in the motion you're debating, and that is the social service ecosystem in Edmonton as it stands now, which I keep hearing from police officers and others is really, really fractured. That Reach Edmonton has helped a great deal, but there's still a lot of players doing a lot of different things in the system, sometimes working at cross purposes, sometimes competing for the same clients. What's your view on the need to address that as part of the overall solution to community safety and reforming that system? Is that something that the Community Safety and Wellbeing Task Force that you proposed might handle?
I can't agree more with the premise of your question, and for a number of reasons, Keith, and thank you for asking about this. I think there's phenomenal work that happens on the front lines with many of the agencies who deliver services to vulnerable people in our community, but I do believe there's duplication in that system. I do believe there's misalignment and folks occasionally working at cross purposes, and I do think there's competition for resources and opportunities to better align and perhaps consolidate. When we struck the End Poverty Edmonton Task Force, one of the important things we looked at was opportunities to address just that. Consolidation, streamlining, and alignment. But because the majority of the funding there comes from the provincial government, we can try to influence that, but we can't control it. We've even seen challenges around this question with the response to supporting people experiencing homelessness during the COVID challenge. So certainly it's a real challenge for us in this city. That response is fragmented and the space is fragmented. I can't control that, but I do think as one of the funders, we have to look at that. And again, through End Poverty Edmonton, we've looked at that. Reach Edmonton has looked at that. And I hope that, to the thrust of your question, that the Community and Safety and Wellbeing Task Force will be able to look at that and in turn provide advice back to the provincial government as primary funder of these activities to look for alignment to a common community safety and well-being strategy that should lead to better outcomes, potentially at lower cost, but at least for the resources that are in the system here today, including our reallocation from policing to prevention in a small way with the 11 million.
Thank you. And next we'll go to Scott Johnson from 630 CHED. Go ahead, Scott.
I better get the Canada Day question in here before it gets too far away from us. Toronto passed a recommendation to have masks worn inside. Dr. Hinshaw was asked about that today and said it's up to cities. So, Mayor, do you think we should all be forced to be wearing masks when we're inside in different stores, restaurants, etc.?
Well, up to this point, generally speaking, the City of Edmonton has followed the Government of Alberta's advice on this and all of these questions around public hygiene measures. I suspect there will be questions on Thursday at our Emergency Advisory Committee meeting about just this question. We've had lots of input from citizens, from business owners, and from public health experts, or at least self-proclaimed public health experts on social media, saying that it really is time to look at mandatory mask orders in a variety of public settings, from public transit to indoor spaces. So just having seen what Toronto's done today, where the structures are different because they have their own public health officer at the civic level. So it's not an automatic follow that we would do that unilaterally. I think we'd look to the Government of Alberta, but with it is a concern that case counts seem to be continuing to grow in Alberta, and if that's being managed appropriately and is a question of a contagion related to inappropriate gathering and violation of other public health rules around food sharing and lack of physical distancing, then if the evidence points to that, then we may not be at the point where a mask order is needed yet. But I don't think that conversation is going to go away. And I think, as I said, I think we're going to have a discussion about that at our council on Thursday. Because we don't have a state of local emergency, I'm not sure that we're in a position to give a unilateral order to mask up off city property. So perhaps outside of transit in private residences, businesses, I'm not sure it would be up to us. So what I would most prefer, for the sake of clarity within our region and within our province, is a clear direction from the province in response to these different moves and the best science. Frankly, I'd like Dr. Hinshaw to let us all know what the right thing to do is on this based on their intelligence and the best science available.
Thank you. And the last question was from CTV's Jeremy, and it's that NHL insiders are suggesting that tomorrow there could be an announcement that Edmonton and Toronto will be the hub cities for the playoffs. And how do you feel about that? And what do you think that means for our city?
Well, it's exciting prospect, but it's hard to comment on speculation or rumor at this point. Obviously, the situation in the United States is tragically and distressingly rapidly deteriorating. So if there's two remaining Canadian markets where though case counts are rising, they're rising slowly, and our public health and public health care systems are responding ably, and Canadians, specifically Torontonians and Edmontonians, are we're not often united between Toronto and Edmonton, but if we're all being good Canadians, it'd be a great Canada Day reward to this country and to these cities for the work that our citizens have done to keep counts low, to have the opportunity to, subject to all of the right restrictions for their own protection and for public protection, welcome the NHL for Hockey Night in Canada, eh?
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. And like I said, again, we'll be continuing this on Thursday, and there will be a media availability after that, after our Emergency Advisory Committee as well. So stay tuned to that for Thursday. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.